I'm going to make a few points presented in thesis form, because I think, as Mark Twain said, I did not have time to write a shorter letter. So it's given the fact we've only got a few minutes, I'll keep it brief. First point, the unfulfilled potential of 1989, or in the terms of this session, the unfulfilled potential of the new political thinking. The new political thinking obviously wasn't simply Gorbachev's idea. It was developed since at least, well, some people said in the 1950s, in the various institutions of the Soviet Union. And it was actually quite, the whole history of the new political thinking, I think, is a subject well worth developing, because it had the potential, and I would argue it still has the potential, to act as the basis of a new type of international politics. Amongst the ideas, some of the ideas of the new political thinking were important because they rejected some basic ideas of Marxism-Leninism. For example, that Western capitalist democracies are militaristic by their very nature. So it repudiated the old idea of the early 20th century of imperialism as a higher stage of capitalism, which would mean it would always be violent. The repudiation of this idea, the belief that the Western political order you can actually make peace and live with it in peace, was a fundamental ideological change. It may well have been premature, because as we know, since 1989, the West has not been peaceful. It has been one war after another, many of them wars of choice. So I think that a debate, a big debate about foreign policy within the framework of the new political thinking, where it was right and where it was wrong, I think is way overdue. And so that's in general. But also the unfulfilled potential, or in fact the potential of 1989, or the new political thinking, was the shift from social solidarity to human solidarity. This was formulated in the way, as we've just heard, a shift away from class to human values. But this itself was a repudiation of the, well, as Mikhail Sergeyevich still insists, the social democratic or socialist potential of the transformation of that time. In other words, this was the repudiation of a progressive interpretation of the new political thinking and of the changes of that time. So instead of which, as we've seen in the last 2 days, we've had the ideology of returnism, of going back to something, the shift from temporal, that is, the time horizons, towards spatial, that the future lies not in the future, but the future lies to the west, which is an extraordinary intellectual shift, which undermines the very basis of the historicity of the countries making that shift. It affects all the post-communist countries, but above all Russia, because the historicity of Russia as a subject of international politics and of ideological debate and philosophical self-realization is so deep. In other words, Russia as a civilization, in almost any framework, would not be able to move fully in that direction. So Samuel Moyn calls this the shift from human solidarity to, from social solidarity to human solidarity as the last utopia. So very interesting that in the very moment of the repudiation of allegedly repudiation of ideological modes of thinking, in the very heart of the transcendence of the ideologies of that time, we have a new ideology, quite apart from the end of history, but we have a new ideology, human solidarity, which was a very explicit repudiation of the social solidarity. In other words, a repudiation of social democracy, of socialism, towards liberalism, neoliberalism, and so on, which had been gathering force for at least a decade before 1989. So that's one. And in the way that this then worked out in politics, geopolitics at the time, this was Malta, which of course was exactly 30 years ago, at the Malta summit, we see the way that this then works out. At Malta, we now have some information, because there's no transcripts of the discussions in Malta between Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush. but we do now have quite a lot of evidence of what happened. It was quite clear, in short, that this was the culmination of what George H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft, Secretary of State, had been talking about. That is, to seize the ideological initiative from Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. Very explicitly, if you look at their memoirs, they have this, who is this upstart, this Gorbachev character, putting forward ideas and trying to, and becoming popular across the world in all sorts of ways. One particular way, of course, was the common European home. Now, however valid this term may be, it was a particular vision of pan-continental European integration. It was not based necessarily on institutions, although there could have been some institutions. A European Security Council was one of the ideas that came up later. But there's also, instead of the Jean Monnet type thinking of institutions, we could have had David Mitriani type functionalist integration on a pan-continental way. This was a model and a development which was quite realistic at the end of the Cold War. Functionalist integration rather than organizational, institutional enlargement of the Jean Monnet sort of European Union as we see today. In short, in Malta, the idea was, and they came to it explicitly, and it had been going on since George H.W.'s speech in Mainz a year and a half earlier, we need to move away from the language of a common European home. And what idea did they come up with? Europe, whole and free. Now, Europe, whole and free, great idea. We all love that. Who's against it? Paris Charter, October 1990, and so on. So, great stuff. But what I'm saying, and it's quite now clear, that at the very moment that the Cold War ends, the Cold War is perpetuated within the ending of the Cold War. So it continues. It never ended. But quite explicitly, that the concept and the way that all the ideological institutional development for the last 30 years has been a continuation. There was never a genuine substantive transcendence. Look at the memoirs, look at the stuff which has developed. So this led to the Cold Peace, which we saw from 1989 to 2014, a Cold Peace in which none of the fundamental questions and problems of European security or even ideological reconciliation took place because of this incommensurability of ideas that had known. So that's my first big point, and I'm not sure how many I can do in the next 2 minutes. But my second one is to say, well, let's step back a little bit and ask what's going on. What's the big picture? And the big picture is something along the following lines, I think. And it's something like the argument that we saw after the end of the First World War, the creation of the Atlantic power system. It's lots of normative values, Woodrow Wilson in it, all of that. But it was it began to take shape, obviously idealistically in the League of Nations, etc. But it was then given substantive form in the Atlantic Charter in 1941, before the United States joined the war. I can't go into detail, but it brought once again that human solidarity into international affairs, that ideological viewpoint. Then we have the foundation of NATO and so on. But the post-war development of what later became known as the liberal international order. So in short, we have the Atlantic power system, which creates after 1945, in partnership with the Soviet Union, the Arab world, and many, many others, the institutions of global governance, including the United Nations, and so on. But what we see is an extraordinary shift after 1989, that basically the Atlantic power system, which until that time had been no more than a regional hegemonic system, by the US, delivered many great public goods, of course, but nevertheless it was a regional system. After 1989, it goes global. It claims, and in fact it rebrands itself from being the Atlantic power system, which clearly doesn't sound all that good, but it becomes the liberal international order, which sounds jolly nice. And this, as the liberal international order, it claims to be universal. It claims to be synonymous with order itself. And this is a huge claim. And it's an unacceptable claim to all sorts of countries, it's unacceptable by definition to civilization states like Russia and China and India and some smaller civilization states. So just simply, it was always such like John Mearsheimer has just recently published an excellent article, we've worked on this a bit together, in International Security called Why the Liberal International Order Was Doomed to Fail. So that's the second point. Second point, just to end that. So what we actually see at that moment is that, and touching on from what the report we've just heard, we have the historical West, which Russia and the Soviet Union wished to join. But by the act of joining, as part of what they thought was the transcendence of the Cold War, the idea was that this historical West would become a greater West. And on the European level, the European Union would become a common European home in which you would have a diversity of social forms, all committed to basic human values, of course, and human rights and all the rest, but institutional diversity and a diversity of elements. In other words, a refusal to accept that the regional hegemony, US-led regional hegemony, would be universal and that it would be absolutely applicable to all countries and would not allow other smaller hegemonies within that framework. So that's the second point, the failure to transform the historical West into a greater West. So what we have instead of a development of transformation, and reading just recently Gorbachev's latest books, he still talks about transformation of the international system. Those ideas of perestroika and his understanding of the new political thinking is still on the agenda. Instead of which, and against which he complains, of course, is we've got the logic of enlargement, the logic of expansion. And that's a hugely different dynamic. It, by definition, it undermines the subjectivity of the other. You cannot have even international relations if you have an expanding system which claims to be synonymous with order itself and all the best and good values. Then anything else which joins it is only like in your Marxist system, is not only mistaken, it's obviously fundamentally evil. Because why doesn't it accept this benign, good, expanding order? I mean, and I'm not saying it's a bad order, but nevertheless the logic, the political logic is already embeds this cold peace. And if you look at the memoirs of the 1990s, it was Yeltsin, before even Putin was a glimmer in Yeltsin's eye. This was quite clearly, already the term cold peace was used in 1992, Yeltsin used it in December 1994, and we see the Clinton archives, the way that Yeltsin was opposing it. That's the second point. So we see that my third point then would be this problem of 1 minute universalism, is that if this Cold War, this hegemonic system becomes universally, then you cannot have space for others. So therefore, the whole language, for example, and patriarchally, of spheres of influence, the classic language of international diplomacy disappears. Sergei Prozorov has done a marvelous book precisely saying why European Union-Russian relations ended badly. Because there was never a normal interstate or relations between equal subjectivities. It was always, we give, you take, as it were, one-sided. So no ability for Russia to have its own, no space at all for development. And this is what the Cold Peace. And finally, we have, if I've got time, just the fourth point, after 2012, we move into a new epoch, which I call Russian, it's neo-revisionist. And this is important, that Russia is not a revisionist state. Basically, at the vertical level, and this is fundamentally important, when the United States and the United Kingdom call Russia and China revisionist states, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what revisionism is about. Russia and China, etc., who are now aligned, do not wish to destroy the international system as it has developed over the last 500 years. Now, my model is based on the English school thinking of Edley Bull, Adam Watson, and so on. It's had 500 years development of how an international system should work. And in recent years, we've seen at the top level a whole network of international organizations, obviously the United Nations, created by the Yalta-Potsdam Order, which the Soviet Union involved. That top level, WTO, all those bodies at the top. Yeah, all those bodies at the top. At the vertical level, Russia and China are still in support of the international system in which these bodies work. But at the horizontal level, they're saying that this is, we can use the word multipolarity if you like, where there's multi-orders. You've got the Atlantic power system, or you could call it liberal international order if you like. I prefer to call it the Atlantic power system on this side. And then you have others going on elsewhere at the state level, at the second level. By the way, there is the third level of international civil society and economic organizations, but that's by the way. So in other words, Russia vertically supports the international system as today, horizontally rejects the expansionist logic and the universalism of what was never a universal system and could not be. But the false universalism of the Atlantic power system is where we are today. It's breaking down. And this is, therefore, a moment of great opportunity, because we're now moving exactly after 30 years into this challenging and finding a language in which we have alignment. And I think it's a very positive moment. And there's people, even the United States, is beginning to defect from the Atlantic power system, which it created. It's taken a crazy guy to say sensible things. And that's the tragedy of our times. Thank you.